I stood on the front porch of my daughter Vivian's sprawling estate in Westwood Heights, clutching a bottle of vintage Cabernet and a hand-signed card. I thought I was there to celebrate her 15th wedding anniversary. The house was a monument to modern excess, massive white pillars that looked like marble from the street but revealed themselves as hollow plaster the closer you got. It was a house built for the eyes of neighbors, not for the soul of a family. I reached for the polished brass doorbell, a practiced smile on my face, ready to play the role of the doting, slightly slowed down father. Then, the sharp, rhythmic vibration of my phone cut through the evening air. I pulled the device from my breast pocket, the screen's glow harsh against the twilight. It was a text from Atticus Thorne, my personal attorney and a man who had stood by my side for nearly 4 decades. The message was cryptic and urgent. Do not sign anything tonight. Call me the second you are out of earshot. This is a code red, Elias. My heart hammered against my ribs with the force of a sledgehammer hitting a support beam. Atticus didn't use words like code red unless the foundation was literally crumbling. I stepped back from the door, retreating into the deep shadows of a manicured cypress tree, and dialed his private line. He answered before the first ring could even finish. Elias, listen to me very carefully. Atticus's voice was low, vibrating with a professional fury I'd rarely heard. A courier just dropped a packet at my firm. Vivian has filed an emergency petition to activate a durable power of attorney over your entire estate. She's submitted an affidavit claiming you've been diagnosed with rapid onset cognitive decline. They have a developer from Blackwood Holdings lined up to buy Cedar Ridge for pennies on the dollar. They want to close the sale tomorrow morning at 9. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. Cedar Ridge. My 200 acres of prime, rolling timberland, and the farmhouse I'd built with my own 2 calloused hands 40 years ago. That land was where I had taught Vivian to ride a horse. It was where my late wife, Eleanor, and I had planned to watch our sunsets until the clock ran out. They were selling it tomorrow. They're claiming you're a danger to yourself, Elias. Atticus continued, his voice cutting through my shock like a diamond blade through concrete. They say you've become compliant and suggestible. If you sign so much as a dinner menu tonight, they can use it as proof that you are under their supervision. Do not put pen to paper. Do you understand me? I'm working on a counter-injunction, but for the next 12 hours, you are in the lion's den. I understood. I understood with a cold, blinding clarity that washed away the warmth of the evening. The sudden invitations to Sunday brunch, the accidental mentions of my blood pressure, the way her husband, Pierce, had been asking pointed questions about my property tax exemptions. It wasn't love. It wasn't even concern. It was a calculated demolition job. They thought I was just an old, retired contractor living on a pension. A relic of a bygone era who could be shuffled into a nursing home like an unwanted piece of furniture. They had no idea that I still held a 40% stake in the Sterling Group, the largest construction firm in the tri-state area, hidden behind a series of impenetrable blind trusts. They had no idea they were declaring war on the man who had laid the literal foundations of half the skyscrapers in the city skyline. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, high-fidelity digital recorder I used for dictating project notes. I clicked it on, felt the haptic vibration of it starting, and slipped it into the front pocket of my jacket. The microphone peeked out just behind a decorative handkerchief. I smoothed my tie, straightened my spine, and put the confused smile back on my face. It didn't reach my eyes. The wrecking ball was in motion. I pressed the doorbell. The door swung open, and there stood Vivian. She was draped in a silk dress that likely cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. Her smile was blinding, a neon sign flickering with a fake, desperate energy. "Dad, you're finally here," she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that felt more like a restraint. She smelled of expensive orchids and an underlying scent of anxiety. "Come in. Come in. Pierce is just decanting the wine. We've been so worried you'd get turned around in the dark." I stepped into the foyer, my boots echoing on the cheap laminate flooring that was trying and failing to look like hand-scraped oak. To an amateur, this house was magnificent. To a builder, it was a death trap of corners cut and budgets overspent. I looked at the crown molding and saw the hairline fractures where the house was settling unevenly. It was a castle of cards, and I was looking at the 2 people who had spent their lives blowing on the base. Pierce walked out of the kitchen, drying his hands on a linen towel. He was in his early 40s but dressed like a 20-something tech mogul, wearing white sneakers that cost $1,000. "Elias, good to see you, old man," he said, his voice dripping with a patronizing warmth. "You look a little peaked. Are you feeling okay?" The drive over wasn't too much for you, was it? The game had officially begun. This was the gaslighting Atticus had warned me about. They needed to establish a record of my frailty. I looked at him, blinking slowly, letting my gaze wander as if I couldn't quite focus. I'm all right, Pierce. The streetlights on the turnoff seemed a bit dimmer than usual. I think I took a wrong turn at the florist, but I found my way eventually. I intentionally slurred the word eventually just a fraction of a beat. I caught the lightning-fast glance between Vivian and Pierce. It was a look of pure predatory satisfaction. They thought the bait had been taken. "Come sit down, Dad," Vivian said, her hand gripping my elbow with a firmness that was entirely unnecessary. "Sloane is here too. She's just finishing up a social media thing." My 19-year-old granddaughter Sloane was slumped on the designer sofa in the living room, her face illuminated by the blue light of her phone. She didn't stand. She didn't even look up. "Hey, Grandpa," she mumbled, her thumbs flying across the screen. This was the girl for whom I'd established a 7-figure college fund. This was the girl whose first car, a vintage convertible she'd already dented twice, I had quietly paid for. To her, I wasn't a person. I was a malfunctioning ATM that was taking too long to dispense her next luxury. The dining room table was set with surgical precision, roast beef, truffled potatoes, and a wine list that was clearly designed to impress. But the conversation wasn't a celebration. It was an interrogation disguised as small talk. Vivian poured me a glass of wine, filling it to the very brim. "So, Dad," Vivian said, her knife clinking rhythmically against the china as she sliced her meat. "We were so concerned last Tuesday. We called 4 times and you never picked up. Did you forget where you put the phone again?" I hadn't forgotten. I had been in a closed-door board meeting for the Sterling Group, finalizing a $30 million merger, but I couldn't tell her that. Not yet. I rubbed my temple, feigning a sudden sharp headache. I think the battery died, Vivian. I looked for the cord in the kitchen, but the drawers all seemed to be in the wrong place. My memory. It's like a sieve lately." Pierce leaned forward, his eyes gleaming like a wolf's in the dark. "That's terrifying, Elias. Truly, living all alone out there at Cedar Ridge. It's not safe anymore. What if you leave the stove on? What if you fall and can't reach the phone? It's too much for one man to manage." I took a slow sip of the wine. It was bitter, though whether it was the vintage or the bile rising in my throat, I couldn't be sure. "The Ridge is my home, Pierce. Eleanor and I poured the foundation ourselves. Every nail in that house has my fingerprint on it." Vivian dropped her fork. The clatter was jarringly loud in the silent room. "Mom is gone, Dad. She's been gone for 5 years. You're living in a mausoleum, holding on to ghosts. We just want you to be safe." We found this incredible lifestyle community in the city. They handle the cooking, the cleaning, the taxes. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. Lifestyle community. That was the euphemism for a high-end warehouse where they could park me and wait for the estate to clear. I looked around the room and saw the cracks they didn't know I could see. I saw the stack of overdue notices tucked under a decorative bowl on the sideboard. I saw the desperation in the way Pierce gripped his wine glass. They didn't care about my safety. They were drowning in a sea of high-interest debt, and they viewed my land as their life raft. "I'll have to think about it," I said, letting my hand tremble as I reached for a dinner roll. "It's such a big change." "We can help you with the thinking part," Pierce said smoothly. He reached under the table and produced a sleek leather folder, sliding it toward me across the white tablecloth. "Actually, we wanted to take a burden off your shoulders tonight. This is just a standard administrative form. It allows Vivian to handle the boring stuff, utility bills, property insurance, the mundane paperwork that's been piling up on your desk. If you sign this, you never have to deal with a clerk again." I looked down at the document. It wasn't for utility bills. It was the durable power of attorney Atticus had warned me about. It was a total transfer of my legal existence. If I signed that paper, I would effectively become a ghost in my own life. Sloane finally looked up from her phone, her expression bored and entitled. "Done. Just sign it, Grandpa. Mom's been crying for weeks because she's so stressed about your bills. Just do it so we can have dessert." I looked at the pen Pierce was holding out to me. A silver Mont Blanc, a gift I had given him 3 Christmases ago. I reached for it, my hand shaking with a violence that was only half faked. I watched their eyes. They were hungry. They were leaning in, their breathing shallow. Vivian was holding her breath, her fingers clutching the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. I took the pen. I brought the nib down toward the signature line. I saw Vivian's shoulders begin to relax. She thought she had won. She thought the old builder was about to sign his own death warrant. Then, I intentionally twitched my wrist. My elbow caught the stem of my wine glass. The deep blood-red liquid erupted across the table, soaking the legal document instantly, turning the standard form into a soggy crimson mess. "Oh heavens!" I cried out, dropping the pen and standing up with a panicked clumsiness. "Look what I've done! I'm so sorry, Vivian! I don't know what happened. My hand just jerked. I grabbed my linen napkin and began frantically dabbing at the paper, accidentally tearing the signature line right down the middle as the wet fibers gave way. Pierce stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "For God's sake, Elias, watch what you're doing!" The mask of the caring son-in-law didn't just slip, it shattered. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Vivian hissed, a warning at him, her eyes darting to me. Pierce took a jagged breath, forcing his features back into a semblance of calm. It's okay, Dad. It's just wine. We can print another copy. It'll just take a minute." No, I said, leaning against the table as if I were about to faint. "I've ruined everything. I'm making a mess. I feel dizzy. Vivian, I think the excitement is too much. I need to go home. I forgot to take my evening heart medication. I have to go right now." Vivian moved to block the door, her eyes narrowing. "Dad, you can't drive if you're dizzy. Stay here. We'll get you a glass of water, print the new papers, and you can sleep in the guest room. You'll be much safer here." I looked her dead in the eye, and for a split second, I let the Elias Sterling who had managed 3,000 steelworkers shine through. "I cannot stay, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping an octave into a tone of cold steel. "If I don't take that pill in the next 40 minutes, Dr. Vane said I could have a massive cardiovascular event. You wouldn't want me having a heart attack on your brand new rug, would you?" The mention of a heart attack made her hesitate. If I died before the POA was signed, the estate would go to probate, and she'd be fighting the Sterling Group's board for a decade. She didn't have a decade. She didn't even have a month. "Fine," Vivian snapped, her patience finally fraying to the point of breakage. "Go home, take your medicine, but I'm coming to the Ridge tomorrow morning at 8. We'll do breakfast and we will finish this. Do you understand?" I shuffled toward the front door, my steps heavy and dragging. Pierce was staring at the ruined document on the table, his face ashen. He knew they were running out of time. I opened the heavy front door and the cool night air hit me like a benediction. I turned back one last time. "Happy anniversary, you two," I said. I walked to my truck, my movement slow until I was safely inside the cab. I locked the doors, and the second the interior lights dimmed, my posture straightened. I reached into my pocket and pressed the stop button on the recorder. I had it. I had the pressure. I had the lies about the document's content. I had Pierce's verbal abuse. Most importantly, I had the confirmation that they were coming for the Ridge tomorrow morning. I started the engine, but I didn't head for the farm. I headed for the city center. Atticus Thorne was waiting for me in his penthouse office. We had exactly 10 hours before the sun came up, and by the time Vivian arrived at my front door for breakfast, she was going to realize that the man she tried to bury was the one who owned the graveyard. The city lights below Atticus Thorne's penthouse office looked like scattered diamonds on a bed of black velvet, but all I could see were the cracks in the foundation of my own family. It was nearly 1 a.m., the hour when the rest of the world slept, but for men like Atticus and me, the night was when the real work got done. The office smelled of expensive leather, aged scotch, and the cold, sterile scent of high-stakes litigation. Atticus was sitting behind a desk made of a single slab of petrified wood, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the hour. He didn't look at me like a friend tonight. He looked at me like a general assessing a soldier who had just crawled out of a trench. "You look like hell, Elias," he said, sliding a crystal tumbler of amber liquid across the desk. "Drink. You're gonna need it for what I'm about to show you." I took a seat in the heavy leather chair, the familiar creak of the springs providing a small measure of comfort. I didn't touch the drink. I needed my mind sharp, a scalpel ready to cut out the rot. I played the part, Atticus. I gave them the stumbling, the confusion, the clumsy old man act. They bought it. They were so eager to see me fail that they didn't even question the timing. Atticus leaned forward, his face illuminated by the glow of 3 different computer monitors. "They didn't just buy it, Elias. They bet their entire lives on it. While you were playing the fool in Westwood Heights, my team was digging into the Sterling Group's internal ledgers and Pierce's personal holdings. What we found makes the power of attorney look like a minor clerical error. This isn't just about greed anymore. This is about survival. He turned one of the monitors toward me. It was a spreadsheet, a dizzying array of red numbers and frantic transfers. Pierce didn't just lose money on bad tech stocks. He got involved with a private equity group called Vane and Associates. It's a front for high-interest predatory lending. He leveraged his entire stake in your subsidiary companies to fund a luxury resort development in the Caribbean that never existed. It was a Ponzi scheme, Elias. And the men behind it? They aren't the kind of people who send polite letters. They're the kind who send people with heavy boots and no conscience. I felt a cold chill settle in the small of my back. I knew the name Silas Vane. He was a shadow in the construction world, a man who built empires on the bones of bankrupted families. If Pierce owed him money, then my daughter wasn't just trying to rob me, she was trying to sacrifice me to save herself from a shark. How much? I asked, my voice raspy. 12 million, Atticus replied. And they have 30 days to produce the first 5 or the interest doubles. That's why they need Cedar Ridge. The land is worth exactly 6 million to Blackwood Holdings because of the new highway bypass coming through next year. They aren't selling your home, Elias. They're paying a ransom. I closed my eyes for a moment, the image of Vivian as a little girl flashing behind my lids. I remembered her sitting on my lap in the cab of my first excavator, her tiny hands over mine as we moved the earth. I remembered the way she'd look at me with such pride when I'd come home, covered in sawdust and sweat. Somewhere along the way, that pride had curdled into a sense of absolute, toxic entitlement. She didn't see the sweat that built the empire. She only saw the empire as her birthright, something she was owed regardless of the cost. What did I do wrong, Atticus? I whispered to the empty room. I gave her everything. I made sure she never knew a day of struggle. Was that the mistake? Did I build a fortress so strong she forgot how to fight for herself? Atticus stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city I had helped create. You gave her the world, Elias, but you forgot to give her a compass. She thinks the Sterling name is a shield, but she's turned it into a weapon, and she's pointing it at the only person who actually loves her. He turned back to me, his eyes hard. Now, do you want to keep mourning the daughter you thought you had, or do you want to handle the woman who's trying to destroy you? I set the tumbler down, the liquid inside perfectly still. Tell me about the doctor. Dr. Julian Vane. Any relation? Brother, Atticus said. Silas provides the muscle. Julian provides the medical justification for the predatory takeovers. It's a closed loop. They find wealthy, aging targets with debt-ridden heirs. Julian signs the incompetency papers, and Silas liquidates the assets before the victim even knows they're in a fight. It's a well-oiled machine, Elias. And Vivian just handed them the keys to your front door. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the same feeling I used to get right before we'd trigger a controlled implosion on a condemned building. We need to move the liquidity, now. Every cent that isn't tied up in the Sterling trusts needs to vanish into the Kensington offshore accounts. Leave the local checking account at the Ridge with just enough to look managed. I want them to see exactly what they think. Is there a dwindling pile of cash and a valuable piece of land? Atticus nodded, his fingers already flying across a keyboard. Consider it done. I've already flagged the Sterling board. We're moving to an emergency closed session tomorrow at noon. But Elias, if they come to the Ridge tomorrow and you don't sign, they might get desperate. Silas Vane doesn't like losing a $6 million payday. Let them get desperate, I said, standing up. My joints didn't ache anymore. The weight of the evening had been replaced by a singular cold purpose. I've spent 40 years learning how to build things that last. Tomorrow I'm going to show them what happens when you try to tear down a structure with a reinforced core. I spent the next 4 hours with Atticus and his lead investigator, a former federal agent named Garrett Moss. We went through the files on Pierce's gambling debts, Vivian's secret credit cards, and the private messages between them and Julian Vane. The more I read, the more the last embers of my fatherly heart turned to ash. They weren't just waiting for me to be confused. They were actively discussing the dosage of the medications Vane was going to prescribe me to ensure I stayed compliant. They were talking about me like I was a livestock animal being prepped for slaughter. What about the granddaughter? Garrett asked, tapping a photo of Sloane. She's been making some interesting purchases lately. A luxury apartment in the city, under a shell company. Tuition is paid through the end of the year, but there's a recurring payment to a high-end concierge service that specializes in, shall we say, party planning for the elite. I looked at the photo of Sloane. She looked so much like Eleanor, it hurt to breathe, but the eyes were different. Eleanor's eyes were filled with a restless curiosity. Sloane's were filled with a hollow, grasping greed. She was already spending the money from the sale of the ridge. She was already living on the proceeds of my destruction. Buy the building, I said, my voice cold and flat. Atticus paused. Excuse me? The luxury apartment building where Sloane is staying, I repeated. I happen to know the developer. He's been looking for an exit strategy on that property for months. Buy the holding company that owns the deed. I want to be her landlord by the time the sun hits the horizon. If I'm going to be the senile old man they're managing, I might as well own the roof over their heads. Elias, that's a lot of capital to move on a whim, Atticus cautioned. It's not a whim, Atticus. It's a strategic acquisition. If they want to play games with property and guardianship, I'll show them how the game is played at the professional level. I want every bit of leverage we can get. I want them to feel the walls closing in before they even realize the door is locked. I left Atticus's office at 5 a.m. The air was crisp, the city beginning to stir with the first early commuters. I drove my old truck back toward Cedar Ridge, the engine's rumble a grounding presence in the quiet morning. As I pulled up the long gravel driveway, the farmhouse looked peaceful, nestled among the ancient oaks and the rolling hills. It was a place of memories, of laughter, of the life I had built from nothing. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the heavy oak table. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat there in the gray dawn, listening to the house settle. I thought about the breakfast Vivian was going to bring. I thought about the care she was going to offer. I reached into the cupboard and pulled out a small, unassuming jar. It was where I kept the emergency key to the floor safe in the study, the one Vivian thought she knew the code to, but didn't. Inside that safe wasn't just gold or cash. It was the original deed to the Sterling Group and a letter from Eleanor, written in the final weeks of her life. A letter I had never shown Vivian, a letter that contained a warning I had been too blind to heed until tonight. I heard the distant crunch of gravel. A car was coming. I looked at the clock. 7:45 a.m. They were early. Desperation has a way of making people lose their sense of timing. I stood up, rubbed my face to bring back the look of exhaustion, and let my shoulders slump. I practiced the slight tremor in my right hand. The knock on the door was sharp, insistent. Not the knock of a daughter coming to see her father, but the knock of a creditor coming to collect. "Dad, it's Vivian. We brought breakfast." I didn't answer immediately. I let them wait. I let them wonder if I was still asleep, or if I had finally drifted off into the confusion they so desperately needed. I walked to the door, my heart a cold stone in my chest. "I'm coming, Vivian," I called out, my voice thin and wavering. "I'm coming. I couldn't remember where I put my slippers." I opened the door, and there she was, Pierce standing right behind her like a shadow. They both looked tired, their eyes bloodshot, their smiles strained to the breaking point. They were carrying a bag of pastries and a tray of coffee, but their eyes weren't on me. They were darting past me, into the house, looking for the folder they had left on the table the night before. "Good morning, Dad," Vivian said, stepping inside without being invited. "How are we feeling today? Did you take your medicine?" I looked at her, and for a fleeting second I saw the little girl again. But then I looked at the silver Mont Blanc pen tucked into Pierce's pocket, and the ghost of the little girl vanished. "I took something, Vivian," I said, letting a slow, strange smile spread across my face. "But I don't think it's what you were expecting." Pierce's smile faltered. "What does that mean, Elias?" I didn't answer. I just turned and walked toward the dining room, my steps suddenly, terrifyingly steady. "Come in, children. Let's have our breakfast. We have so much to discuss, and so little time left." As they followed me into the room, I saw Vivian's eyes land on the table. The legal document from the night before was gone. In its place was a single black and white photograph of the three of us from 20 years ago, and a small blinking light from the digital recorder I had hidden in the center of the floral arrangement. The trap was set, but what I didn't know, what I couldn't have seen coming, was the black SUV that was currently turning into my driveway, carrying a man who didn't care about legal documents or construction firms. Silas Vane had arrived, and he wasn't here for breakfast. The silence that followed my declaration was heavy, thick with the metallic tang of fear. Pierce's hand, still clutching the tray of lukewarm coffee, began to tremble. Vivian's face shifted through a kaleidoscope of emotions, confusion, suspicion, and finally, a cold, hard desperation. She looked at the blinking red light of the digital recorder nestled among the daisies on the table, and for a second, I saw the realization hit her. I wasn't just Elias, the aging father they could manipulate. I was Elias Sterling, the man who had survived 4 decades of cutthroat union strikes and economic collapses. But the moment of clarity was shattered by the sound of footsteps on the porch, heavy, rhythmic, and entirely devoid of hesitation. The screen door didn't just open, it was shoved aside with a violence that made the old wood groan. Silas Vane stepped into my kitchen. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like a billionaire on his day off, wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat, a cashmere scarf, and eyes that were as gray and lifeless as a winter sea. Behind him stood a man nearly 7 feet tall, a silent wall of muscle whose only purpose was to remind everyone in the room that the era of polite conversation was officially over. "Elias," Silas said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, my chair, and sat down with the easy grace of a king surveying a conquered province. "I've heard so much about you. The legendary builder, the man who laid the bones of this city." I didn't move. I kept my hands folded on the table, maintaining the slight tremor I'd perfected over the last 48 hours. "I don't believe we've met," I mumbled, letting my voice crack. "Vivian, who is this man? Is he from the bank?" Vivian's voice was a jagged whisper. "Silas, you weren't supposed to be here. We told you we'd handle the signature. My father is he's had a rough morning." Silas didn't even look at her. He reached out and picked up the digital recorder from the floral arrangement. He turned it over in his gloved hand, a faint, amused smile touching his lips. "Handling it, Vivian? You've been handling it for 6 months, and yet, here we are. Your father is playing games with toy recorders, and my brother Julian is waiting in the car with a medical kit because you couldn't close a simple real estate transaction." He squeezed the recorder. The plastic crunched, a sharp, snapping sound that felt like a bone breaking. He dropped the ruined device onto the table and looked at me, his gaze boring into mine. "The act is over, Elias. My brother is a doctor. He's currently filing the final paperwork with the state. By noon, you won't just be confused. You will be a ward of the state, under the direct supervision of your daughter. And she, in turn, will be under my supervision." I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment the floor truly dropped out from under me. I had prepared for a legal battle. I had prepared for a financial chess match. I hadn't fully prepared for the sheer, brutal illegality of the Vane brothers. "You can't do this," Pierce stammered, stepping forward with a false bravado that evaporated the moment Silas's bodyguard shifted his weight. "We had a deal, Silas. We get the ridge, we pay the debt, and we're square. You said my father-in-law would be taken care of." Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "He is being taken care of, Pierce. He's being relieved of the burden of his choices. Just like you're being relieved of the burden of your debt." He looked at me again. "Sign the deed, Elias. Sign it now, and we can skip the part where Julian has to administer a sedative to keep you comfortable during the transition." I leaned back, my mind racing through the blueprints of my life. I thought back to Eleanor, my late wife. She had seen the early warning signs long before I did. 10 years ago, when Vivian had asked for her first $1 million investment for a fashion boutique that went bankrupt in 3 months, Eleanor had pulled me aside in this very kitchen. "Elias," she had said, her voice soft but firm, "you've built her a palace with no exits. She doesn't know how to value what she didn't build. If you keep giving her the fruit without the labor, she'll eventually want the whole tree, roots and all." I hadn't listened. I had been too busy building the Sterling Group, too busy thinking that money was a shield I could wrap around my family to keep them safe from the world's sharp edges. I had made them soft, and in their softness, they had become rotten. The first real warning sign I'd ignored was 3 years ago. During the Christmas gala, I'd caught Pierce in the study, sweating through his tuxedo, trying to guess the combination to my floor safe. I'd laughed it off then, thinking he was just curious or drunk. I didn't realize he was already drowning. I didn't realize the new money lifestyle he and Vivian were projecting was actually a facade built on a foundation of shifting sand. "Dad, please," Vivian said, her voice breaking into a genuine sob. She knelt beside my chair, her hands clutching at my sleeve. "Just sign it. If you don't, Silas, he won't just take the farm. He'll take everything. He'll take Sloan. He told us what happens to people who don't pay." "I'm scared, Dad, please." I looked down at her. This was the daughter I had raised. She wasn't just a villain. She was a victim of her own greed and the monsters she had invited into our home. But she was also the woman who, 48 hours ago, had referred to me as a bag of bones in a text message. She was the woman who had already picked out the wallpaper for my room in the nursing home. "Where is the paper, Silas?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Silas signaled to his bodyguard, who produced a leather-bound folder and a heavy, gold-plated pen. They laid it out in front of me. The deed of transfer. The document that would end the Sterling legacy at Cedar Ridge and turn this sanctuary into a suburban sprawl of overpriced condos. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy, like a lead pipe. I looked at the signature line. "One thing," I said, looking up at Silas. "I want to see the doctor. If I'm as sick as you say I am, I want a professional to tell me to my face." Silas checked his watch, a smirk playing on his lips. "Julian should be at the gate by now. He's bringing the assessment paperwork and a few samples of the medication you'll be starting tonight. It's a very effective cocktail, Elias. It takes the edge off the world. You'll find you won't care about the farm much longer. You won't care about much of anything." That was the twist. They weren't just taking my land. They were planning to chemically lobotomize me. If I were a zombie, I couldn't testify. If I were a zombie, I couldn't change my will. If I were a zombie, the Sterling Group would fall into their hands through the back door of the power of attorney. I looked out the window. A second vehicle, a sleek black sedan, was winding its way up the gravel path. Dr. Julian Vane, the man who traded his Hippocratic oath for a seat at Silas's table. My heart was thundering, but my mind was a cold, calculated machine. I had 10 minutes. 10 minutes before the doctor arrived with the needles. 10 minutes before the medical emergency was staged. I need a glass of water," I said, clutching my chest and leaning forward. My heart, it's fluttering. "Pierce, get me a glass of water." Pierce scrambled toward the sink, his movements frantic. Silas watched him with disdain, his attention momentarily diverted by the weak, pathetic man my son-in-law had become. In that split second, I did something they didn't expect. I didn't sign the paper. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my primary phone, the one they thought I'd lost, and hit the enter key on a pre-written command. Behind me, in the study, the silent alarm I'd installed 20 years ago began to broadcast a signal directly to Atticus Thorne and Garrett Moss. But more importantly, it triggered the security lockdown protocol for the Sterling Group's digital assets. If my heart rate didn't trigger a safe code on my smartwatch within the next 30 minutes, every account associated with the Sterling name, including the ones Pierce had tried to leverage, would be instantly frozen and flagged for a federal audit. "What was that?" Silas asked, his eyes narrowing as he heard the faint, high-pitched hum of the electronic lock engaging on the study door. "Just the house settling, Silas," I said, my voice suddenly clear, the tremor gone. I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time he saw the man who had built the city. This house was built to withstand a lot of pressure. "I wonder if you can say the same for your organization." The front door opened, and Julian Vane stepped in, carrying a black medical bag. He looked at the room, the cowering son-in-law, the weeping daughter, and me, sitting upright and defiant. "Is there a problem?" Julian asked, his voice clinical and cold. "The patient is being difficult," Silas said, standing up. "Julian, I think it's time for that assessment. We don't have all day." Julian walked toward me, his hand reaching into his bag for a syringe. My daughter screamed. Pierce hid his face. I didn't blink. I knew something they didn't. I knew that Garrett Moss and a team of private security were currently 5 minutes out, but I also knew that Silas Vane didn't leave witnesses when a plan went south. "Wait," I said, holding up my hand as the needle glinted in the morning sun. "Before you do that, you might want to check your phone, Silas. I think your Blackwood deal just hit a snag." What happened next changed everything. Silas's phone didn't just ring. It erupted with a dozen simultaneous notifications. His face went from arrogant calm to a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "What did you do?" he hissed, leaning over the table. "I didn't do anything," I said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. "I'm just an old, confused man, but it looks like Omega Holdings just bought the debt on your brother's medical clinic, and I'm the one who decides if the doors stay open today." The cliffhanger wasn't just the arrival of the police or the security team. It was the look on Silas's face when he realized that in the world of construction, you never try to demolish a building until you've checked to see if the owner is still inside with the detonator. But as the room descended into chaos, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A faint, muffled sound from the basement. Sloane. She wasn't at her luxury apartment. She was here. And she wasn't alone. The sound from the basement wasn't a thump or a crash. It was the muffled, rhythmic scraping of a chair against concrete, followed by a soft, choked sob that I would recognize anywhere. It was the sound Sloane used to make when she was 6 years old and had fallen off the porch swing. It was the sound of my granddaughter in pain. The room, already heavy with the scent of brewing coffee and cold malice, seemed to contract. Silas Vane didn't flinch. He didn't even look toward the basement door. He simply smoothed the lapel of his charcoal coat and looked at me with a terrifying, predatory patience. "You thought you were the only one with a contingency plan, Elias?" Silas asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "You thought I'd walk into the home of a man who built a billion-dollar empire without a bit of insurance? Your Omega Holdings move was clever. Truly, I didn't think you had the stamina to coordinate a debt acquisition in the middle of the night. But while you were buying paper, I was securing the one thing you can't replace with a wire transfer." Vivian let out a strangled cry, her hands flying to her mouth. "Silas, you said she was at the apartment. You said she was safe." "She is safe, Vivian," Julian Vane interjected, his voice as sterile as a surgical theater. He was still holding the syringe, the needle glinting like a needle-thin shard of ice, for now. "But your father seems to think this is a business negotiation. We need to remind him that this is a family matter, and in a family everyone shares the consequences." I felt the rage rising in my chest, a hot liquid fire that threatened to burn through the confused facade I had struggled to maintain. I looked at the basement door, then back at Silas. The early warning signs I'd ignored for years began to play in my mind like a highlight reel of my own failures. I remembered Sloane's 18th birthday party, a $250,000 affair at the Kensington Plaza. I'd seen her tucked in a corner with a man who looked exactly like Silas. I'd thought he was just another wealthy suitor, someone from the new money circles she ran in. I'd seen her wearing a diamond pendant that I hadn't bought her, one that looked suspiciously like a piece Eleanor had kept in the safe. I'd asked her about it, and she'd laughed, calling me forgetful, saying I'd gifted it to her months ago. I had doubted my own mind then. I had let the seeds of my own perceived senility be planted by a teenager I adored. "Let her up, Silas," I said, my voice no longer wavering. It was the voice that had commanded 10,000 men on the Sterling Plaza project. "You want the Ridge? You want the Sterling Group? You deal with me. Leave the girl out of this." Silas signaled to his 7-foot shadow. The man walked to the basement door, unlatched the heavy iron bolt I'd installed for storm safety, and disappeared into the dark. A moment later, he emerged, dragging Sloane by the arm. But she wasn't tied up. She wasn't bruised. She was wearing her designer jacket, her makeup slightly smeared from crying, but as she stepped into the kitchen light, she didn't run to me. She didn't run to her mother. She walked straight to Silas and stood beside him. "Grandpa, just stop," Sloane said, her voice shaking but devoid of the warmth I'd spent 19 years nurturing. "Just give them what they want. You're being so selfish. You're sitting on all this money, all this land, and for what? To grow old and die in a drafty house? We're drowning, and you're just watching us sink." The betrayal was a physical blow. It felt like a structural failure in my own ribcage. "Sloane, what have you done?" "She did what any smart investor does, Elias," Silas said, patting Sloane's hand with a sickening paternalism. "She realized the bag of bones wasn't going to let go of the keys willingly. She's the one who gave us the digital access codes to your private server. She's the one who told us about the Omega Holdings shell company months ago. We knew you'd try to buy the clinic debt. We let you do it because it emptied your liquid reserves into an account we're about to seize anyway." I looked at my daughter, Vivian. She looked horrified, her eyes darting between her daughter and the monster she'd invited into our lives. She hadn't known. Pierce, however, looked down at his shoes. He had known. The perfect American family was a nest of vipers, and I had been the one providing the heat. "You gave them the codes?" I whispered to Sloane. "The ones I gave you for your emergency fund? The ones that were supposed to protect you?" "My whole life has been an emergency, Grandpa," Sloane shouted, her entitlement finally boiling over into a shrill, ugly scream. "I'm tired of waiting for you to die. I'm tired of being the poor Sterling because you think luxury is a sin. You have millions, and you make me drive a car that's 3 years old. You make me live on a budget. Silas says that with the Ridge sold and the Sterling Group liquidated, I'll never have to hear the word budgely again." I saw the psychological tension of the last decade snap in that moment. I saw the way Vivian had groomed her, the way Pierce had enabled her, and the way I had funded the whole tragedy. I had built a skyscraper of pride, and my granddaughter was the one who had rigged the explosives at the base. Julian Vane stepped forward again, the syringe leveled at my arm. The emotional stress of this home invasion is clearly too much for you, Elias. You're having a breakdown. As a medical professional, I'm making the call. You need to be stabilized before you hurt yourself or your family. Don't you touch him, Vivian suddenly barked, stepping between me and the doctor. Her voice was trembling, but the mother in her was finally fighting the debtor. This wasn't the plan, Silas. You said we'd just move him to the city. You said he'd be happy there. You didn't say you were going to turn my daughter into this. Silas didn't even look at her. He simply nodded to his bodyguard. The man moved with a terrifying, blurred speed, grabbing Vivian by the shoulders and shoving her back into the dining room chair. The plan changed the moment your father decided to be a hero, Silas said. Now, we're doing this the hard way. Julian, sedate him. Pierce, get the pen ready. We're going to help Elias sign his name, and then we're going to take him for a very long drive. I watched as Julian moved in. I saw the sweat on his forehead. He was a doctor, but he was a gambler first, and he was terrified. He knew that if this didn't work, he was going to prison for the rest of his life, but he was more afraid of his brother than he was of the law. I looked at the gold-plated pen on the table. I looked at the deed of transfer. I looked at my granddaughter, who was watching with a cold, detached curiosity, waiting for her payday to arrive in a needle. I felt the cold prick of the needle against my skin through the fabric of my jacket. Julian was aiming for the muscle in my shoulder. Wait, I said. My voice dropped to a whisper so low they all had to lean in to hear it. What now, Elias? Silas asked, his patience finally gone. You mentioned that Sloane gave you the codes to my private server, I said, a faint ghost of a smile appearing on my lips. Did she tell you about the dead man's switch I installed after the Sterling Plaza fire in '08? Sloane's face went pale. The what? A dead man's switch, I explained, the clarity in my voice now a weapon. It's a simple piece of code. If my biometric signature, my heart rate, my blood pressure, my thumbprint isn't verified every 60 minutes on my encrypted tablet, the server doesn't just lock, it broadcasts. It sends the last 48 hours of audio and video from this house, the Westwood estate, and Atticus Thorne's office to the state attorney, the IRS, and the FBI. I looked at my watch. I haven't checked in for 55 minutes, Silas. In 5 minutes, the recordings of you discussing the chemical lobotomy of a private citizen will be sitting on the desk of every major news outlet in the country. Silas froze. Julian's hand began to shake so violently the needle danced against my arm. You're lying, Silas hissed. You don't have the technical skill to set that up. I don't, I agreed, but the firm I hired to build the Sterling Group's cybersecurity does. And unlike you, Silas, I pay my people well. I pay them for loyalty. I pay them to protect the foundation. The tension in the room was a physical weight. The escalation had reached its peak. We were all standing on the edge of a precipice, and the wind was starting to pick up. Give me the tablet, Sloane, Silas roared, turning on my granddaughter. Where is it? Where does he check in? I don't know, Sloane stammered, backing away. He never showed me that. He just gave me the access codes for the funds. 4 minutes, I said, leaning back and closing my eyes. The clock is ticking, Silas. You can sedate me, you can kill me, you can take the ridge. But by the time the ink is dry, you'll be the most wanted man in America. And Julian? You'll be the first doctor in history to be executed for medical treason. Julian dropped the syringe. It shattered on the hardwood floor, the clear liquid pooling like a wasted life. Silas, we have to go. We have to get out of here before the broadcast hits. Shut up, Silas screamed, his composure finally shattering. He lunged across the table, grabbing me by the collar of my polyester suit. Where is the tablet, Elias? Give it to me, and I'll walk away. I'll leave the girl. I'll leave the house. Just give me the check-in. I opened my eyes. I looked at the man who had tried to steal my soul. I looked at the daughter who had betrayed me, and the granddaughter who had sold me. It's in the floor safe, I said, pointing toward the study. The one Pierce couldn't open. The code is Eleanor's birthday. But I wouldn't rush if I were you, Silas. The safe is rigged with a secondary alarm. The moment you enter the code, the local sheriff gets a silent entry alert. Silas looked at the study door, then back at me. He was trapped. He was a man who lived in the shadows, and I had just turned on every light in the building. What happened next changed everything, I thought to myself, as I watched Silas sprint toward the study. I didn't tell him that the dead man's switch didn't exist. Not in the way I'd described it. I didn't tell him that the tablet wasn't in the safe. I didn't tell him that the real dead man switch was currently standing on my front porch, armed with a battering ram and a warrant. The sound of the front door being kicked in was the sweetest music I'd ever heard, but as the police swarmed the kitchen, I saw Sloane dive for the basement door. She wasn't running from the police. She was running to something she'd hidden down there, something that made me realize the betrayal was even deeper than I'd imagined. The thunder of the front door splintering was a sound I'd spent 40 years hearing on demolition sites, but in the sanctuary of my own kitchen, it sounded like the end of the world. The air was suddenly filled with the sharp ozone scent of flashbangs and the heavy rhythmic shouting of men who didn't care about the fine china or the memories soaked into the floorboards. Blue and red light strobed against the wallpaper, turning the room into a frantic, disjointed nightmare. I watched through the haze as Silas Vane froze halfway to the study. He was a predator, but even predators know when the cage has been dropped. His bodyguard reached for something in his jacket, but he was pinned against the refrigerator by 4 men in tactical gear before his hand could even clear the holster. Silas, ever the aristocrat of the underworld, didn't fight. He simply raised his hands, his face a mask of cold, calculating fury. He looked at me, and if looks could ignite, Cedar Ridge would have been a bonfire. "You've burned it all, Elias," he hissed over the din. "You think this is a victory? You've just invited the vultures to pick over what's left of your family." I didn't answer him. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the basement door. I'd seen Sloane's eyes right before she dived into the dark. It wasn't the look of a girl running from the law. It was the look of a thief running for the loot. I knew every inch of this house. I knew the crawl spaces, the false headers, and the places where the shadows grew deep. I knew there was nothing in that basement but old canning jars and the weight of 40 years of dust. Or so I thought. I pushed past a deputy who tried to hold me back, my legs moving with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a man of 71. "That's my granddaughter," I shouted, the lie coming easily now, the concerned old man mask providing the cover I needed to get to the stairs. I swung the door open and descended into the cool, damp air of the cellar. The lights were flickering, the old wiring struggling with the sudden surge of power to the house. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw her. Sloane wasn't hiding in the corner. She was at the far wall, the one behind the furnace, where I'd built a reinforced concrete room for Eleanor's emergency supplies. She had a crowbar in her hand, one of mine, taken from the garage. She was frantically prying at a loose brick I'd never noticed. She was sobbing, but it was a dry, hollow sound, the sound of a gambler reaching the bottom of the deck. "Sloane," I said, my voice echoing off the concrete. She jumped, the crowbar clattering to the floor. She spun around, and in her hand, she held a small, black waterproof case. It was the kind of case I used to transport high-level blueprints and sensitive contracts. "Get away from me, Grandpa," she screamed, her voice bouncing off the low ceiling. "You don't understand. You've always had everything. You've always been the great Elias Sterling. But what about me? I'm just the granddaughter. I'm just the decoration." Silas promised me a seat at the table. He said that if I gave him the hard copies, I wouldn't have to live in your shadow anymore. I felt a coldness settle in my gut that no heater could touch. Hard copies? "What are you talking about, Sloane?" She clutched the case to her chest like it was a holy relic. "The off-ledger contracts, the ones Mom and Pierce found in your old files. The kickbacks from the Sterling Plaza project. The bribes for the zoning boards." Silas said that with these, the Sterling Group doesn't just fold, it becomes his. He said he'd make me the youngest CEO in the city's history. He said I'd be more powerful than you ever were. I looked at the case. I looked at the girl I'd taught to fish in the creek behind the barn. I realized then that the rot hadn't started with Pierce's gambling or Vivian's greed. It had started with me. I had built a legacy based on power and acquisition, and I had never taught them that the most important thing you can build is a character that doesn't need a bribe to feel significant. But there was one thing Sloane didn't know. Something Silas had hidden from her. "Sloane, listen to me," I said, taking a slow step forward. "The Sterling Plaza project didn't have kickbacks. I was the one who blew the whistle on the city council that year. I spent 6 months in a safe house because I refused to play their game. Those files, they aren't evidence of my crimes. They're the evidence of the people I put away. People like Silas Vane's father. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs." Sloane's eyes darted back and forth, her mind trying to reconcile the lie she'd been sold with the truth of the man standing in front of her. "No," she whispered. "No, Silas said. He said you were a criminal just like him. He said you were just better at hiding it. He needed those files to find out who the witnesses were, I said, my voice dropping to a low, urgent rumble. He didn't want to make you a CEO, Sloan. He wanted to use you as a retrieval dog to find the names of the people who could testify against his family's latest schemes. The moment you handed him that case, you weren't an investor. You were a liability, a witness who knew too much. I saw the moment the realization hit her. I saw the way her shoulders slumped, the way the arrogance drained out of her, leaving behind a terrified 19-year-old girl who had just realized she'd betrayed her only protector for a man who viewed her as a disposable tool. "Grandpa," she breathed, her voice small and broken. I gave him the access codes to the house security yesterday. He said it was just so he could protect us if you had a medical episode. I didn't know he was going to bring a doctor. I didn't know about the needles. I reached out my hand. "Give me the case, Sloan. Let's go upstairs. We can still fix this." She started to reach for me, her fingers trembling, when a shadow fell across the stairs. I didn't hear him come down. I didn't hear the creak of the wood, but I felt the presence. I turned and there was Silas. He wasn't in handcuffs. He was flanked by two men I didn't recognize, not deputies, not tactical team members. They were wearing local sheriff uniforms, but their eyes were wrong. Their posture was wrong. "You really should have retired years ago, Elias," Silas said, his voice echoing with a mocking cheerfulness. "You're still thinking in terms of right and wrong. You're still thinking the law is something that applies to men like me." He stepped into the basement, his polished shoes crunching on the grit of the floor. "I've owned the sheriff's department in this county for a decade. The raid you saw upstairs, that was just a bit of theater to clear the room of the unreliable elements. The real players are still on the field." He looked at Sloan, his expression one of bored disappointment. "And you, my dear, you were doing so well. But your grandfather is right about one thing. You are a liability. A girl with a conscience is a dangerous thing in my line of work." He held out his hand. "The case, Sloan. Now." Sloan backed away, her heels hitting the concrete wall. She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. I stepped in front of her, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was an old man, and there were three of them, at least two of whom were armed. "The broadcast is still going to happen, Silas," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "The dead man's switch. It doesn't care who wears the badge." Silas laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "We found the tablet, Elias. Your daughter was very helpful. She pointed it out the moment we told her we could make the charges against her disappear. She's currently upstairs, signing a statement that says you attacked her during a dementia-fueled rage. By the time anyone sees your broadcast, you'll be in a psych ward, and the files in that case will have been lost in a tragic fire." He looked at his watch. "The fire should be starting in about 3 minutes. The old wiring in this basement, it's a tragedy waiting to happen. An old man and his granddaughter caught in the blaze. A fitting end for the Sterling legacy." I looked around the basement. The flicker of the lights was more pronounced now. I smelled it, the faint, acrid scent of gasoline. They hadn't just come to talk. They had been prepping the house while I was downstairs. "Run, Sloan," I whispered, not taking my eyes off Silas. "She has nowhere to go, Elias," Silas said, nodding to his men. The two deputies drew their weapons. I felt a surge of adrenaline, that old primal instinct that had kept me alive on 100 dangerous job sites. I looked at the heavy iron support beam directly above Silas's head. I'd installed it myself 40 years ago. I knew that the bolt holding the secondary brace was a shear bolt designed to break under extreme pressure to prevent the whole floor from collapsing in an earthquake. I also knew that the release lever for the emergency furnace shutoff was right behind my hand. "You're right about one thing, Silas," I said, my voice dropping to a growl. "I am a builder, and a builder always knows exactly what it takes to bring the whole house down." I didn't wait for him to respond. I grabbed the furnace lever and yanked it with every bit of strength I had left. At the same time, I lunged for the crowbar Sloan had dropped. What happened next was a blur of violence and noise. The furnace didn't just shut off, it backfired. A massive whump of air and dust that filled the basement with a choking cloud of soot. I swung the crowbar, not at the men, but at the shear bolt on the support beam. The sound of the metal snapping was like a gunshot. The secondary brace swung down with the force of a falling safe, catching one of the deputies across the shoulder and pinning him to the floor. The other fired a shot, the bullet whining off the concrete, but the dust was too thick for him to see. "Sloan, the coal chute!" I roared. I grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the small rectangular opening in the foundation where we used to have coal delivered in the 40s. It was narrow, choked with cobwebs, but it led directly to the outside. "Go. Don't look back. Get to Atticus. The real files are in the safe at the office." She scrambled into the chute, the black case still clutched in her hand. I turned back to the room, the dust beginning to settle. Silas was coughing, his charcoal coat covered in soot, his eyes wild with a sudden, dawning fear. He looked at the pinned deputy, then back at me. "You're staying here, Elias," he screamed, reaching for a weapon he'd hidden in his overcoat. I didn't run. I moved toward the stairs, but as I reached the first step, I felt a sharp, searing pain in my side. I looked down. My shirt was turning a dark, blooming red. I hadn't heard the shot, but the fire in my nerves told the story. I stumbled, my vision beginning to blur at the edges. I looked up and saw Silas standing there, the gun leveled at my chest. "Goodbye, Builder," he said. But before he could pull the trigger, the ceiling above him didn't just creak, it vanished. The weight of the piano in the living room, combined with the structural failure I'd just triggered, sent the floorboards crashing down. I fell back into the shadows as the living room collapsed into the basement, a mountain of wood, plaster, and expensive furniture burying Silas Vane in a tomb of his own making. I lay there in the dark, the sound of the crackling fire growing louder above me. I was bleeding, I was trapped, and the house I loved was burning. I closed my eyes, the image of Sloan escaping through the coal chute the last thing I saw. I didn't know if I'd survive the night. I didn't know if the Sterling name would ever recover, but as the heat began to blister the air, I felt a strange, cold peace. I'd spent my life building things that were supposed to last forever. I finally understood that the only thing worth building is the truth, and the truth was currently running across the fields of Cedar Ridge, carrying the evidence that would burn Silas Vane's empire to the ground. Then, through the roar of the flames, I heard a voice. Not Silas, not the police. It was Vivian, and she wasn't screaming for help. She was laughing. The laughter was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was the shrill, jagged pealing of a mind that had finally snapped under the weight of its own darkness. I lay pinned in the debris of my own basement, the heat from the growing fire above licking at the exposed rafters. Blood warm and slick was soaking through my shirt, and my vision pulsed in time with the searing pain in my side. I looked up through the jagged hole in the ceiling, through the dust and the rising smoke. Vivian was standing on the precipice of the collapsed living room floor, silhouetted against the flickering orange light of the fire. She wasn't calling for the police. She wasn't looking for her daughter. She was staring down at the wreckage of the piano that had crushed Silas Vane, her face twisted into a mask of hideous triumph. "You really thought I was the weak link, didn't you, Dad?" She called down, her voice echoing strangely in the hollowed-out space. "You thought I was just a desperate debtor being bullied by Silas. You thought I was the victim of my own greed." I tried to speak, but my throat was a desert of soot and dry terror. I managed only a raspy cough. "I called Silas," she continued, pacing the edge of the abyss like a predator. "I'm the one who told him Pierce was skimming from his accounts. I'm the one who suggested that the only way to get his money back was to liquidate Cedar Ridge. I didn't want the land, Elias. I wanted the insurance. I wanted the Sterling Group to be decapitated so I could take the settlement and vanish. I'm the one who poured the gasoline in the foyer while you were playing hero in the basement." The world tilted. The physical pain of the bullet wound was nothing compared to the psychic agony of realizing that the woman standing above me, the child I had raised to be a pillar of the community, was the one who had lit the match. She hadn't just been a passenger in Silas's scheme. She had been the architect of the demolition. Why? I managed to choke out, the word tasting like ash. "Because you never stopped being the boss," she shrieked, the laughter replaced by a decade's worth of fermented resentment. "Every gift came with a lecture. Every investment came with advice. You didn't give me a life, Elias. You gave me a mortgage on your expectations. I wanted to see you burn in the house you loved more than me. I wanted to see Silas buried in the ruins of the empire he tried to steal. And now? Now I'm the grieving daughter who lost her father and her home in a tragic accident caused by a senile man and a crooked businessman." She looked at the flickering flames. "Goodbye, Dad. Don't worry. I'll give Sloan a very small allowance from the insurance money, if she survives the night." She turned and vanished into the smoke, her footsteps light and hurried. I was alone. The fire was growing, the old cedar beams of the house acting like tinder. I looked at the mountain of debris pinning my legs. I looked at the blood pooling on the concrete. This was rock bottom. I had built cities, and I was going to die in a hole, betrayed by my own blood. But Vivian forgot one thing. She forgot that a builder doesn't just know how to put things together, he knows exactly how to find the path of least resistance in a collapse. I felt a surge of cold, clarifying rage, the kind of rage that overrides the body's desire to quit. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the crowbar Sloane had dropped. It was wedged under a splintered joist. I gripped it, the metal cold and reassuring. I didn't try to lift the debris. I used the crowbar as a lever against the furnace housing, shifting the weight just enough to slide my trapped leg out. The pain was an explosion of white light. But I didn't scream. I crawled. I didn't go for the stairs, they were already a chimney for the fire. I went for the coal chute. I dragged my body across the grit, every inch of movement, a battle against the darkness encroaching on my vision. I reached the chute, the narrow opening Sloane had escaped through. I hauled myself up into the narrow, soot-choked tunnel, my fingers clawing at the stone. I felt the night air cool, crisp, and smelling of freedom. I tumbled out onto the grass, away from the roaring inferno that had once been my home. I lay on the lawn, watching the flames roar into the night sky. The roof caved in with a sound like a thunderclap, sending a pillar of sparks toward the stars. My past was burning, my legacy was ash. Then, a pair of headlights cut through the dark. A black SUV skidded to a halt on the gravel. I expected the police. I expected Silas's men. Instead, Garrett Moss stepped out, followed by Atticus Thorne. "Elias!" Atticus shouted, running toward me. He looked at the burning house, then at my blood-soaked side. My God, we were at the gate. Silas's men had the road blocked. We had to take the service trail. "She's gone," I whispered, clutching Atticus's coat. "Vivian. She's the one. She's the spark." Garrett knelt beside me, his hand steady as he applied a pressure bandage to my wound. "We have Sloane, Elias. She made it to the highway. She has the case. But she's talking. She's telling us things we never suspected." "Get me out of here," I rasped. The world needs to think I died in that house. Let the insurance claims go through. Let her think she won. I want her to feel the victory right before I take the floor out from under her." For the next 10 days, Elias Sterling ceased to exist. I was moved to a private medical wing in a high-security facility owned by the Sterling Group, a place even Vivian didn't know about. While the news reported on the tragic fire at Cedar Ridge and the presumed death of industry titan Elias Sterling, I sat in a darkened room, watched over by Garrett and a team of surgeons. The bullet had missed my vitals, but the infection had been a close fight. It didn't matter. The physical healing was secondary to the mental preparation. I had a tablet in my hand, and for 18 hours a day, I watched. I watched the hidden camera feeds from the Westwood Heights estate. I watched the forensic accountants peel back the layers of Vivian's secret accounts. I watched as she sat on her designer sofa, sipping wine and crying for the cameras, playing the role of the shattered orphan while she negotiated the sale of my remaining shares to a shell company in the Caymans. "She's moving fast," Atticus said, stepping into my room on the 11th day. He looked thinner, the stress of the secret weighing on him. "She's filed the death certificate based on the bone fragments they found in the basement, which we know were actually the remains of Silas's bodyguard. She's already petitioned the board to take over your seat. She's holding a celebration of life service tomorrow at the Sterling Plaza." "A celebration?" I asked, a thin, dangerous smile touching my lips. "A gala," Atticus corrected. "Black tie. She's invited the mayor, the press, the whole city. She wants to be crowned queen of the Sterling Group before the smoke even clears." I looked at the screens. I saw Vivian laughing with her friends on a private call, mocking the old man's sentimentality. I saw Pierce trying to figure out how to access the offshore accounts I had already drained. "And Sloane?" I asked. "She's in the safe house," Garrett said. "She's terrified, Elias. She realized Silas wasn't the only one who wanted her dead. She found a file in that black case she took. A file Vivian had planted. It was a fake confession, written in Sloane's handwriting, taking the blame for the fire and the fraud. Vivian wasn't just going to kill you, Elias. She was going to frame her own daughter to clear her own path. The silence in the room was absolute. The truth was out. The rot wasn't just deep, it was total. Vivian wasn't just an enemy, she was a monster. "It's time," I said, standing up. My side burned, and I needed a cane to walk, but I felt like I was made of reinforced steel. "The foundation is set," The explosives are rigged. Tomorrow, we don't just attend a funeral. We perform an exorcism. What's the plan, Elias? Atticus asked. I looked at the image of the Sterling Plaza on the screen, the building I had built with pride, now being used for a celebration of a murder that didn't happen. We're going to give her exactly what she wants, I said. A night the city will never forget. I want the press there. I want the board there. And I want the big screens in the lobby to play something more interesting than a slideshow of my life. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist was already in motion. As I prepared to step out of the shadows, I received a notification on my tablet. A message from an unknown sender. You aren't the only one who survived the fire, Elias. See you at the party. The game wasn't over. Silas Vane wasn't in the rubble. And tomorrow, the Sterling Plaza was going to become a battlefield. The Sterling Plaza felt different tonight. Usually, this building was my pride, a 60-story glass and steel needle piercing the heart of the city, a testament to what a man can build when he refuses to compromise. Tonight, however, it felt like a mausoleum. The lobby was draped in black silk and white lilies, their cloying scent thick enough to choke a horse. I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine, hidden behind the very structural pillars I had inspected for flaws 30 years ago. I was wearing a tuxedo tailored for a man who didn't have a bullet hole in his side, my face partially obscured by the dim lighting and the brim of a hat. I looked like a ghost because, to the 300 people clinking champagne glasses below, that's exactly what I was. Vivian was center stage. She was wearing a dress of midnight lace, her eyes perfectly rimmed with just enough red to suggest she'd been weeping, though I knew better. She was holding court with the governor and the CEO of First National, her voice a soft, melodic trill of practiced sorrow. She was the grieving heiress, the brave daughter carrying the torch of the fallen titan. Beside her, Pierce looked like a man who had finally stopped sweating. He was drinking the top-shelf scotch I'd kept for board meetings, laughing at a joke made by a developer I'd blacklisted years ago. They were dancing on my grave before the dirt was even settled. The feed is live, Elias. Garrett's voice crackled in my earpiece. He was stationed in the security hub 4 floors below, the room I'd built with its own independent power grid. The media has their own dedicated uplink. They think they're getting a live stream of the celebration of life. They have no idea they're about to broadcast a confession. I leaned against the cold marble of the pillar, my side throbbing. And Atticus? He's in the wings, waiting for the signal, Garrett replied. But Elias, we've got a problem. That message you got on the tablet? We tracked the signal. It didn't come from outside. It's coming from inside the building. Someone is on the private Sterling network, and they're moving through the service corridors. My blood ran cold. Silas Vane. I'd seen the piano crush him, but Silas was like a cockroach. If there was a crack in the foundation, he'd find it. I scanned the room, looking for a face that didn't belong. The elite of the city were all there, but among the servers and the security guards, there were shadows moving that didn't match the Sterling Group's uniform. Focus on the presentation, Garrett, I whispered. I'll handle the hallways. I moved toward the service elevator, using the maintenance key that never left my side. As the doors slid shut, I caught a glimpse of Vivian stepping up to the mahogany podium. The room went quiet. The tribute was beginning. I knew exactly what she was about to say. She was going to talk about my legacy, about the tragic decline of my final months, and about the new direction the Sterling Group would take under her visionary leadership. It was a script written in blood and greed. The elevator hissed as it descended toward the sub-basement. I needed to know who was in my building. When the doors opened, the air was cool and smelled of damp concrete, the familiar scent of my world. I stepped out, my cane clicking softly against the floor. I knew you couldn't stay away, Elias. A voice rasped from the darkness behind the main transformer bank. I turned, my hand gripping the heavy silver head of my cane. Out of the shadows limped a man who looked like he'd been put through a rock crusher and poorly glued back together. Silas Vane's face was a map of bruises and stitches, his arm held in a makeshift sling. He was pale, his breathing labored, but his eyes were still filled with that same serpentine hunger. He was holding a small, high-frequency jammer, the kind used to disrupt digital broadcasts. You're a hard man to kill, Silas, I said, my voice steady. But you're a fool to come here. The police are upstairs. The press is everywhere. Silas chuckled, a wet, rattling sound that ended in a cough. The police? The ones I pay? Or the ones your daughter thinks she can buy with your insurance money? Vivian tried to bury us both, Elias. She let that floor drop knowing I was under it. She's not your little girl anymore. She's a monster I helped create, And now she thinks she can cut the cord. He took a step forward, the jammer blinking red in his hand. I'm not here for the land anymore. I'm here for the leverage. You have the files on my father. I want them. Give them to me, and I'll let you walk out of here. I'll even let the broadcast go through. We can watch her fall together. I looked at Silas, a man broken by his own ambition. The files are already gone, Silas. I gave them to someone you'll never find. And as for watching her fall, I don't need your help for that. Silas's face contorted. He reached into his coat, but he was slow, too slow. I didn't need to be a young man to win this fight. I just needed to be a builder who knew the specs. I stepped back and slammed my cane into the emergency fire suppression override on the wall. A high-pitched siren wailed, and the heavy halon gas began to hiss into the sub-basement. It wasn't toxic, but it displaced the oxygen. In his weakened state, Silas didn't stand a chance. He gasped, dropping the jammer as he scrambled for the stairs. I didn't follow him. I headed back to the elevator. I had a daughter to face. Upstairs, the gala was reaching its emotional peak. I stepped out onto the mezzanine just as the lights dimmed. A massive screen behind Vivian began to glow. My father was a man of steel. Vivian's voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with honeyed deception. But even steel can fatigue. In his final days, he lost his way. He became a shadow of himself. We are here tonight not just to mourn him, but to celebrate the firm foundation he left behind for us to build upon. She signaled for the video. The crowd leaned in, expecting a montage of black and white photos and soaring orchestral music. Instead, the screen flickered to life with a grainier, sharper image. It was the interior of Dr. Julian Vane's office. The audio was crystal clear. Severe cognitive impairment. Julian's voice rang out through the Sterling Plaza's million-dollar sound system. He's not capable of making financial decisions. He's a danger to his own estate. Then, Vivian's voice, sharp and cold. Thank you, doctor. The bank needs the assessment today. We have to move before he realizes the accounts are being drained. The room went deathly silent. I saw the governor put down his glass. I saw the board members sit up, their faces turning to stone. Vivian froze, her hands still resting on the podium. She looked back at the screen, her eyes wide with a dawning, frantic horror. The video cut to the kitchen at Cedar Ridge. It showed Silas Vane, Julian, and Vivian standing over me. It showed the syringe. It showed the moment Vivian poured the gasoline. I wanted to see you burn in the house you loved more than me. Vivian's voice echoed through the 60-story tower, raw and hateful. I wanted to see Silas buried in the ruins. I'm the one who lit the match. The celebration of life had become an execution. Vivian turned to the crowd, her face a mask of sweating panic. This is a fabrication, a deep fake. My father was mentally ill. He was obsessed with surveillance. This is a stunt by the people who want to take over the firm. It's not a stunt, Vivian, I said, my voice amplified by the mezzanine speakers. I stepped out into the light at the edge of the balcony. The spotlight operator, coached by Garrett, swung the beam up to me. I stood there, leaning on my cane, looking down at my daughter from the heights of the empire she tried to steal. The gasp from the crowd was a physical wave of sound. People dropped glasses. Women shrieked. It was as if a statue had stepped off its plinth. Dad? Vivian whispered, her voice cracking, the microphone picking up the sound of her soul disintegrating. I walked slowly down the grand spiral staircase, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. Every step was agony, but I didn't let it show. I reached the bottom and walked straight to the podium. Pierce tried to slip away, but Atticus Thorne stepped out from behind a curtain, flanked by 2 uniformed officers from the state police, not the local sheriff's department Silas had bought. The reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. I said into the microphone, my voice steady and cold. But the reports of your crimes, Vivian, are documented in triplicate. I turned to the board of directors. As of 5 minutes ago, the Sterling Group has initiated a moral turpitude clause against Vivian and Pierce Miller. Their shares have been sequestered. Their access is revoked, and their freedom, well, that's in the hands of the district attorney. Vivian lunged at me, her fingernails clawing for my face, but the officers caught her before she could touch me. She was screaming now, not like a queen, but like a cornered animal. She called me a monster. She called me a ghost. She cursed the day I was born. As they led her away in handcuffs, the press swarmed. The flashes of the cameras were like lightning. I stood there in the center of the storm, the man who had built the building, and the man who had just torn down the family. But then, I saw her, Sloane. She was standing at the back of the room, near the exit. She wasn't in handcuffs. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. She had the black case in her hand. She didn't come to me. She didn't apologize. She simply nodded once, a sharp, cold acknowledgement, and disappeared into the night. I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my chest, not the bullet wound, but a realization. The reversal was complete, but the war wasn't over. Sloane hadn't given the files to Atticus. She had kept them. And as the police cleared the room and the lights of the Sterling Plaza began to dim, I realized that the unknown sender hadn't been Silas Vane at all. I checked my tablet one last time. A new message was waiting. "You taught me well, Grandpa. You build the buildings. I'll be the one who decides who gets to live in them. See you at the closing." The granddaughter I thought I'd saved was the one who was now holding the detonator. The coast of Maine is a jagged, unforgiving place, much like the life I have lived. I am sitting on the terrace of a house made of glass and cedar, perched on a cliffside where the Atlantic beats itself senseless against the granite below. The air is sharp, tasting of salt and ancient ice. It's a clean smell, a smell that doesn't carry the scent of gasoline or the cloying perfume of a gala. Here, the only thing I have to build is a moment of peace. 3 months have passed since the night the Sterling Plaza became a crime scene. 3 months since the celebration of life ended with a parade of handcuffs. The legal system, usually a slow and grinding machine, moved with a surprising, surgical efficiency when confronted with high-definition video of a staged murder and corporate espionage. Atticus Thorne is sitting across from me, his face weathered but finally free of the tension that had defined him for years. He's drinking a coffee, a thick blue folder resting on the table between us. It's the final accounting, the closeout report of the Sterling family tragedy. "The sentences came down this morning, Elias," Atticus said, his voice level. "Vivian received 15 years without the possibility of parole for 3 counts of attempted murder and first-degree arson. Pierce got 12 for conspiracy and wire fraud. They've already been transferred to a federal facility. They won't be bothering anyone for a very, very long time." I looked out at the horizon where the gray sea met the gray sky. I thought about the little girl who used to sit on my lap and help me steer the bulldozer. I thought about the woman who laughed while I lay bleeding in a basement. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I had expected. I felt a hollow, echoing silence. I had won the war, but I was standing in the middle of a graveyard. "And Silas?" I asked. "Silas Vane is alive, but barely," Atticus replied. "The injuries from the collapse were severe. He's permanently paralyzed from the waist down, facing a litany of federal RICO charges. He'll spend the rest of his life in a medical prison, watching his empire be liquidated by the state. The Vane brothers are finished, Elias. The foundation they built their criminal enterprise on has been completely excavated." I nodded slowly. The vultures were gone, the predators were caged. But there was one piece of the puzzle that remained the piece that had been bothering me every night since I watched her walk out of the Sterling Plaza with that black case. "What about Sloane, Atticus? You said she hasn't touched the trust funds?" Atticus leaned back, his expression turning thoughtful. "Not a penny. She's been living in a small studio apartment in the city, one that isn't owned by a Sterling shell company. She's working at a diner, Elias, a place called the Rusty Spoon. It's a grease trap near the docks. She's scrubbing floors and waiting tables for minimum wage, but she still has the case. Garrett Moss has been tracking her. She keeps it under her bed, locked in a floor safe she bought with her first 3 paychecks." I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. The Rusty Spoon. That's a hard place to learn the value of a dollar. "It is," Atticus agreed. "But she's doing it. She hasn't called for help. She hasn't tried to leverage the files. She's just waiting." "And Elias?" "She sent me a message this morning. She knew I'd be coming to see you today. She wants to meet. She said she's ready for the closing." I met her 2 days later. Not at the office, and not at her apartment. I met her at the ruins of Cedar Ridge. The house was gone, nothing left but the blackened stone foundation and the chimney standing like a sentinel in the fields. The smell of fire had finally faded, replaced by the scent of winter wheat and damp earth. I stood by the scorched remains of the front porch, leaning on my cane, watching as a battered old sedan pulled up the gravel driveway. Sloane stepped out. She looked different. She wasn't wearing designer labels or silk scarves. She was in a pair of work boots, jeans, and a faded Sterling Group hoodie she'd likely salvaged from a storage unit. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and there was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a hardness that looked a lot like the reflection I saw in the mirror every morning. She was carrying the black waterproof case, "You look tired, Sloan," I said, the wind whipping my coat around my legs. "I'm working 60 hours a week, Grandpa," she said, her voice steady. "Tired is just a baseline now." She walked over to the edge of the foundation and sat on the stone, the black case resting on her lap. She looked at the blackened ruins of the house where I'd raised her. "I used to think this place was a prison. I used to think your rules and your values were just weights you tied to my ankles so I couldn't fly. I thought Silas was offering me a jetpack." "And now?" I asked. "Now I realize that a jetpack doesn't do you much good if you don't know how to land," she said, a bitter, self-aware smile touching her lips. "I spent my whole life thinking I was a Sterling, like it was a title I was born with. I didn't realize that Sterling was something you built, brick by brick, every time you refused to take the easy way out." She patted the black case. "I've spent every night for the last 3 months reading these files. I wanted to find the leverage. I wanted to find the secret that would make me powerful enough that I'd never have to scrub a floor again." I felt my heart tighten. "And did you find it?" Sloan opened the case. She didn't pull out contracts or bribery records. She pulled out a stack of old yellowed letters and a set of blueprints I hadn't seen in decades. "The files Mom and Pierce found. They weren't about kickbacks, Grandpa," Sloan said, her eyes welling up with tears. "They were your journals from the early years. They were the records of every time you almost went bankrupt because you refused to use substandard steel. They were the letters you wrote to the families of the men who were injured on your sites. Letters where you gave them your own personal shares to make sure their kids could go to college." She looked at me, her expression one of profound, soul-deep shame. "Silas told me these were evidence of your crimes. He lied. These are the evidence of your soul. I tried to sell your soul to a man who didn't even have one of his own." She handed me the case. I took it, the weight of it feeling like a blessing rather than a burden. I didn't realize it yet, but that was the moment the Sterling legacy was truly saved, I thought. I didn't tell her that I had known she'd find the truth. I didn't tell her that I'd intentionally left those sensitive files in a place where a thief would find them, knowing that only a person with a conscience would truly understand what they were looking at. "I have one more thing for you, Sloan," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a small brass key. "It's for a locker at the main Sterling Group warehouse. Inside you'll find a set of tools, my father's tools, and a contract for an apprenticeship. It's for the masonry union." Sloan looked at the key, then back at me. "An apprenticeship? I thought you were going to give me the board seat back." "A board seat is just a chair, Sloan," I said, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative rumble. "If you want to lead the Sterling Group, you need to know how the mortar feels between the bricks. You need to know what it's like to build something that people rely on to keep the roof over their heads. If you can finish 4 years of that, if you can earn the respect of the men and women on the line, then, and only then, will the board seat be waiting for you." Sloan took the key. She gripped it so hard her knuckles turned white. She didn't say thank you. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, the same sharp, cold acknowledgement I'd seen at the gala. "I'll be there at 6 a.m. on Monday, Grandpa. Don't expect me to be late." As the sun began to set over the charred remains of Cedar Ridge, I watched my granddaughter drive away. I stood alone in the silence of my land, the wind whispering through the trees I had planted with Eleanor. I spent my life building skyscrapers and bridges, thinking that the strength of a legacy was measured in height and square footage. I thought that by giving my family everything, I was protecting them. I was wrong. By shielding them from the struggle of the build, I had left them without the internal reinforcements they needed to survive the storms of life. Vivian and Pierce were the structural failures of my life, the corners I cut when I was too busy being a provider to be a father. But Sloan was the renovation. She was the proof that even a building that has collapsed can be salvaged if the foundation is still sound. I walked back to my truck, my side still aching, my steps slow. I was 71 years old and I was alone. But as I looked at the blackened foundation of my home, I didn't see an end. I saw a clean site. I saw a chance to build something better. I started the engine and began the long drive back to the coast. I had one more letter to write to the warden of the federal prison where my daughter was staying. It wouldn't be a letter of forgiveness, not yet, but it would be a letter of truth. I wanted her to know that the Sterling name was still standing, and that her daughter was the one who was finally learning how to spell it. The lights of the city flickered in the distance, a million glowing windows in buildings I had raised from the dirt. I checked my tablet one last time. No messages, no threats, just the steady, rhythmic pulse of the city I had helped create. What happened next changed everything, I thought as I pulled onto the highway. But for the first time in my life, I don't need to know the ending. I just need to know that the foundation is level. I am Elias Sterling. I am a builder. And the most important thing I ever built wasn't made of steel. It was made of the strength to walk away from a house on fire and start again.